15 episodes into this channel, and not once have you seen Vlad the Impaler drink blood, sleep in a coffin, or turn into a bat. That wasn't an oversight. It's the actual historical record. Nothing supernatural. Not one contemporary source, hostile or friendly, chronicler or propagandist, ever once suggested Vlad III was anything other than an entirely mortal, entirely human ruler. So here's the question this channel has been quietly building toward since its very first episode. If nobody who actually lived through his reign, wrote about him, feared him, or fought him, ever called him a vampire, where did that part of the story actually come from? The honest answer involves an Irish novelist who almost certainly never set foot in Wallachia, a folklore tradition that had nothing to do with Vlad originally, and a mid-20th century research project that accidentally welded two separate stories together so effectively that most of the world has never questioned the seam. This is the documented story of how a mortal, historical tyrant became the most famous vampire in the world, and it might be the single strangest piece of myth-making this entire series has uncovered. Let's establish something clearly, using everything this channel has already documented across 15 episodes. The German pamphlets this channel exposed in its 4th episode, genuinely vicious, deliberately exaggerated propaganda, commissioned to cover a king's broken promise, never once claimed Vlad was supernatural. They accused him of extraordinary theatrical cruelty, mass impalement, a meal staged among the dying, covered in this channel's 5th episode, nailed turbans. Every accusation was about human brutality, delivered by a human ruler, however monstrous his methods. Michael Beheim's poem, examined in this channel's 10th episode, sourced, possibly, from a traumatized monk's actual testimony, described violence, not the supernatural. Wallachian and Moldavian chronicles, friendlier to Vlad's memory, described a defender against Ottoman expansion, also entirely human. Ottoman sources, describing an enemy who terrified even the conqueror of Constantinople. This channel's very first episode already told you in detail. Still, nothing supernatural. Just an unusually effective, unusually terrifying military and political opponent. For roughly 400 years after Vlad's death, across every hostile account, every friendly account, every piece of exaggerated propaganda this channel has carefully examined, the word vampire simply never appears attached to his name. Not once. Which means something happened sometime after those 4 centuries to change that completely.
That something has a name, and it's not particularly mysterious, even if the exact details of how it happened are less tidy than popular retellings usually suggest. In the 1890s, an Irish theatre manager and novelist named Bram Stoker was researching and writing a Gothic horror novel, a story about an ancient, undead aristocrat preying on Victorian England from a remote Transylvanian castle. Stoker's surviving research notes, real, physical documents scholars have studied extensively, show a writer doing broad, somewhat scattered research into Eastern European geography, folklore, and history, gathering atmospheric material rather than conducting a focused biography of any specific historical figure. Literary historians generally agree Stoker likely encountered the name Dracula through a published travel account about Wallachia and Moldavia, a book that mentioned, in passing, a historical voivode Dracula who had fought against the Ottoman Empire, along with a brief note that the name itself meant something like devil in the local language. That's very likely it. Not deep biographical research into Vlad III's specific reign, his impalements, his propaganda, or anything this channel has spent 15 episodes documenting in careful detail. A striking, historically resonant name, attached to a brief, vague mention of a warrior prince. Exactly the kind of atmospheric detail a Gothic novelist would seize on. Stoker's actual vampire, the blood-drinking, shape-shifting, centuries undead Count, didn't come from anything in Vlad's documented history at all. It came from somewhere else entirely. From a tradition that had been sitting there independently for a very long time. Vampire folklore across Eastern Europe, including traditions in Romania, often referenced by the term strigoi, existed for centuries, entirely independent of any specific historical ruler. These weren't stories about Vlad. They were broader folk beliefs about restless or malevolent dead returning to trouble the living. A genuinely widespread folkloric pattern found in various forms across much of Eastern and Central Europe, tied to burial customs, disease outbreaks that predated germ theory, and centuries of oral tradition that had nothing to do with any 15th century Wallachian prince. Stoker drew on this broader vampire folklore tradition, likely filtered through earlier Gothic vampire fiction that had already been circulating in English literature for decades before he wrote his own novel, for the actual supernatural mechanics of his story. The blood drinking, the aversion to sunlight and religious symbols, the transformation. None of it traces back to anything ever claimed about Vlad the Impaler specifically, in any source this channel has examined across 15 episodes. What Stoker did, in other words, was take two genuinely separate things, a striking historical name attached to a vaguely remembered warrior prince, and an entirely unrelated folkloric vampire tradition, and fuse them together for a work of fiction. It's worth sitting with how thin that fusion actually was at the moment of creation. A name, a setting, a handful of atmospheric details, layered on top of a vampire mythology that Vlad III, as a historical figure, had absolutely nothing to do with. For decades after Stoker's novel was published in 1897, that's largely how things stayed. A wildly popular piece of fiction, using a real historical name, without most readers or scholars treating the connection as anything more than exactly that, a borrowed name for a fictional monster. The conflation this channel's entire audience now takes for granted, Dracula the vampire and Vlad the Impaler as essentially the same figure, hadn't fully formed yet.
That conflation solidified decades later, and it has a surprisingly specific, documented origin point. In the early 1970s, researchers including Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally undertook serious historical investigation specifically aimed at tracing connections between Stoker's fictional Count and the real historical Vlad III. Their published research, most famously a book examining exactly this connection, argued in real historical detail that Stoker had drawn more specifically on Vlad's documented history than had generally been assumed. This channel isn't going to pretend that research was without merit. Some of the connections these historians identified between Stoker's notes and Wallachian history are genuinely credible and well argued. But the popular reception of that research went considerably further than the careful academic argument itself. In the decades since, Dracula was really Vlad the Impaler, and Vlad the Impaler was basically Dracula, became something close to settled popular fact, repeated in tourism marketing, popular documentaries, casual conversation,
absorbed into general cultural knowledge so thoroughly that most people now assume it was always understood that way. It wasn't. For roughly 4 centuries after Vlad's death, and for the first several decades after Stoker's novel, nobody was treating this as an established historical fact. It became one, gradually, through popular research, tourism economics, and the simple narrative convenience of 2 compelling stories merging into one even more compelling story. This channel has spent 15 episodes documenting how Vlad's reputation was built, layer by layer, by monks, poets, kings, propagandists, and eventually novelists and even modern historians. The vampire connection might be the single most successful addition to that myth of all. Not because anyone was trying to deceive anyone, but because it made an already compelling historical figure into something even more culturally powerful. A mortal, brutal, calculating 15th century ruler. A separate, centuries-old folklore tradition about the restless dead. A novelist borrowing a name. And a 20th century research project that, however carefully argued, got popularly simplified into permanent fusion. So here's what this episode actually leaves you with, and it might be the clearest single answer this entire channel has ever given you. Vlad the Impaler was real. Everything this channel has documented across 15 episodes, the Forest of Stakes, the Easter Reckoning, the raids, the propaganda, the family, the disputed death, even the uncertain face, happened to an actual, entirely mortal human being. The vampire never happened to him at all. It happened to his name, decades after his death, borrowed by a novelist who needed something atmospheric and menacing, fused to a folklore tradition that had nothing to do with him, and cemented into popular belief by well-intentioned research that the public simplified far beyond what the actual historians ever claimed. If this channel has proven anything, 15 episodes running, it's that Vlad's real story never needed vampirism to be genuinely horrifying, genuinely tragic, and genuinely worth telling carefully. The man was extraordinary enough on his own. The myth just kept adding layers anyway, right up to the 20th century, because that's apparently what happens to a story this compelling. It doesn't stop accumulating, even after actual historians start trying to correct it. Dracula was real. He built forests of stakes, not coffins. He drank no blood, feared no sunlight, and died, however exactly it happened, as completely, permanently mortal as anyone else who's ever lived. Every week, this channel goes back into the true history behind the legend the world calls Dracula. The forest that made an empire retreat. The grave still debated centuries later. The feast that became a reckoning. The ally who manufactured a monster. The raid that gave that monster its face. The river that may have taken someone he couldn't save. The exile years with a future saint. The final war. The cold case that's still open. The monk whose testimony started it all. The brother who chose the other side. The son who inherited a method he may never have chosen. The signature that may have broken 5 centuries of silence. The diplomacy that failed before the forest of stakes. The face that may never have been his. And now, the vampire
that was never his either.
Subscribe if you'd rather know the real story than the comfortable myth, even when the real story turns out to be the more human one.
We'll see you in the next Chronicle.